Hello and welcome to this Digital Geographies Research Group in Conversation episode. I'm Jack Lowe, the prize coordinator of the Digital Geographies Research Group, which is a research group of the Royal Geographical Society. I'm joined today by Lucas Evans, who was the winner of our latest DGRG Undergraduate Dissertation Prize for his dissertation, Forest, Exploring the Possibilities of Digital Technologies for Enhancing Forest Restoration. Lucas's research examined the Forest app, which is a popular productivity app that enables users to support forest restoration. Lucas's research considered the ways that users engage with the app on an everyday basis and how the platform's design, economic model, and use influences the politics of forest restoration. So welcome, Lucas. I hope you're well. Congratulations again on your fantastic dissertation and for winning our 2023 Dissertation Prize.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. And yeah, it was an honor to receive the award. I really did not expect it, but yeah, it's good to be here and look forward to chatting about it.
Yeah, that's great. Brilliant. So yeah, let's start from the beginning. Talk to me about how you ended up choosing this as a topic for your undergraduate dissertation.
Sure, no worries. This is a fairly convoluted journey to my dissertation topic. I think a lot of people who approach geography, they find their niche pretty quickly and decide to hone in on a certain topic, whereas I have always been attracted to geography for its it's super generalist and very, very broad. But that also meant that when it came to honing down and committing to one topic for 6 weeks of my summer and 12,000 words, it was pretty difficult for me to actually find where that niche would be. And then I started to I've always been a bit of a pragmatist. So I kind of started to look in the realm of we have these environmental problems, how are we connecting individuals in kind of creative and innovative ways to solve those issues. And also, obviously, as geographers do, critiquing and problematizing the ways in which they might be done. So I kind of started with that ballpark, kind of environmental regeneration, connecting individuals. And then I had a look at a few examples, read a few articles, and I became aware of this project called Ant Forest, which was in China. And it was this thing developed by, I'm not sure if you've heard of Alibaba, the kind of conglomerate who do basically everything in China, but they have a subsidiary company, which is Alipay, which is this mobile payment platform. And they had come up with this idea that they would offer users an opportunity and reward them with these green credits for doing kind of green activities. So taking public transport on a day-to-day basis, paying for utilities and stuff through their online platform. And you can kind of accumulate green credit, and then in a similar way to forests, you can redeem that credit by planting a real forest in northern China. And it was kind of in this world of also combating desertification and pollution issues, helping locals with jobs, etc. So anyway, found this example, thought, great, let's look at that. When I was doing my dissertation, it was also the time where we'd kind of come out the other end of COVID. And I think for me, a question I'd always ask myself is obviously we have these environmental issues, but they're very much in the background. So what happens when we have these systemic shocks like COVID? Immediately people forget about environmental problems in the same way that economics over the last couple of years, it's inflation, interest rates, and in these sort of situations in crises, the environmental agenda kind of takes a step back and the foot comes off the gas, so to speak. So I kind of thought actually it could be interesting to look at how the usage and evolution of this platform had changed throughout COVID, before, during, and after COVID. Anyway, I then put together this first round pitch that I delivered to my peer group at university, in my college, and also some people in the younger years, in first and second year, who were kind of getting ready and starting to think about their dissertation. And I got absolutely ripped apart because they were like, my peers were all like, my tutors, they were like, how on earth are you going to investigate this Chinese app? Like, you have the language barriers, the tech barriers. How are you going to find participants for your research? And I was confident. I thought throughout the whole thing, I was like, no, I'll do it. I'll manage it. I'll be fine. I'll find a way to make it work. And then one of my very close friends who kindly reminded me or asked me a question in the pitch, which was, wasn't necessarily a question. It was more of a statement. It was like you've kind of gone about this with the assumption that COVID is over in China. For us in the UK, it was pretty much over and things had gone back to normal. But actually in China, and this was a typical very like Europe, UK centric perspective, but he was like, it's not over. So how are you going to study that after? And that kind of made me realize, and that was the beginning of a bit of a crisis for me because I was like, oh my goodness, I have no idea what I'm going to do now. He's right. I don't know how I'm going to investigate it. It becomes less of an interesting topic. So amidst this crisis and the deadlines for dissertations were approaching and everything, so I had no idea what I was going to do. I considered, again, being a generalist, I was kind of considering completely flipping my idea. And I, as a tutor of mine, worked in the luminescence dating lab, Dr. Julie Durkin, and she was a great professor. And she said, I've got a potential project in luminescence. So I kind of, a day before we were supposed to commit to a topic, I was like, I'm doing luminescence. But then my tutors actually encouraged me, don't completely let go of your idea. There are other ways of kind of exploring this topic. And then that same friend who posed the question about China, he would tell me off if I didn't tell him, if I didn't mention his name and his contribution. He told me about this app called Forest, which I hadn't come across before, but he said his friends use it, and I think it was part of like a GCSE case study that he did for geography long time ago. But he told me about this app, and it did a similar thing. And so I downloaded it, had a brief look into it, and I thought, actually, I can make this work. So that's how I came up with this idea of Forest. And then I'll let you ask another question. Otherwise, I'll ramble on too much. But yeah, so that's how I came across Forest. And then I guess my research completely snowballed from there. And
Yeah.
this complex project.
So it's actually brilliant to get that wider context of how you came about your research topic, because it is really important to think about those journeys into our research and how it isn't always this neat trajectory of,
Yeah,
having a great idea and then doing the research and then having data.
definitely not.
So yeah, you're proof of that for sure. So let's talk a little bit about the Forest app itself and how it works, because we both mentioned it now. Can you give like a brief rundown of what it is and how people interact with it?
Sure. So at a very simple level, it's fundamentally a productivity app. So it uses this method, this studying method called the Pomodoro method. I think it was inspired by that, which is basically this idea that humans and people are most productive when they're learning for shorter intervals of time. And it took this idea and said, why don't we let people set a timer for themselves? So if I want to be productive for 25 minutes, I'll set a timer on the app for 25 minutes. I'll put my phone down to one side. Obviously, my phone can receive notifications and whatnot, and everyone is prone to, you see a notification, you immediately pick up your phone. So I wanted to combat that specific issue. So it was like, we'll set the timer for 25 minutes, put your phone out of sight, out of mind. If you don't pick up your phone, then you're rewarded at the end with these virtual credits in a similar way to what I mentioned with Ant Forest. You're rewarded with this kind of green credit or energy kind of token, which can then be used to, and the main appeal and point of intrigue for me was you could then exchange, once you'd accumulated enough credits, you could exchange these for planting a tree through their philanthropic partner, which is a company called Trees for the Future, which I'm sure we'll touch on later. But you can either do that, or you can also buy kind of in-game trees in the same way that you can buy, like, I don't know, in Mario Kart, you can collect or accumulate all of the different characters in the same way you can collect different tree species and rare species. And yeah, it's built into this. Actually, it's a really aesthetically pleasing design, and a really, I don't know, like cozy. It makes you feel like you're in a nice space, I guess, but it's developed and designed in a very cool way, I have to say. So yeah, that's the app.
Yeah, and you mentioned about the design and everything, and one of the things that you did, of course, in your research was that you learned how to use the app yourself, and you sort of investigated that process of learning how to use it and using the sort of features that it has. So how did you find that process?
Yeah, I thought that was kind of it was a weird one because I hadn't used it and I was planning on going out and into the field, the digital field to be specific, but you kind of, I think it was mainly the inspiration. I labeled it as self-learning just to kind of give it some substance and some oomph. But essentially, it was this idea that you need to have credibility going into research. Like, I'm not going to go and interview people for 45 minutes about an app that I don't understand and haven't used, and in a way formed my own relationship with. And yeah, there's an interesting point which I was going to mention maybe later on if you had another question, but I think this points to the importance of diversity of thought and diversity of your sample. So yeah, I'll go on a bit of a tangent here, but I think it's quite an important point.
Yeah, please do.
Reflecting on my dissertation. And that was my relationship. I mentioned my relationship with the app. I was like, this is awesome. This is a way for me to contribute, even though it's not the most impactful way. Like, I'm gonna try and accumulate my credits, and I didn't buy any other of the in-game like fancy different tree species, etc. I was just like, no, I want points, and I want to get points until I can plant a real tree. This is my way of doing a contribution or making some sort of contribution. But at the same time, I had really emphasized, and we'll talk about this more, but I'd really emphasized I wanted a diverse kind of participant base. I think I very easily could have hinged on personal networks and, but I would have had a lot of the insights that I gained throughout my dissertation came from the fact that I was trying to interview people globally. And one of these particular interviewees that I spoke to, she was from South America. And I kind of approached all of my interviews with my preconceptions about, cool, this is an awesome way to contribute. And then I quite quickly realized when I was interviewing this particular person that her idea and relationship with the app was very different. And she was like, oh, I don't really see the point in planting trees. And I was like, what? You're completely unpicked my dissertation. Like, why am I even doing this? How dare you? But for her understanding and her experience of environmental participation and regeneration was very much embedded in her local community. She kind of said, you guys in a very generalizable way, but you might not experience environmental issues like this on a day-to-day basis in your local spaces. So having this way of contributing to a project all around the world is like quite an appealing thing, and it feels like a contribution for you. But for me, like, I experience these environmental issues on a day-to-day basis and in the places which I inhabit. So for me, what does environmental contribution look like? It looks like actually looking after your local towns and cities and advocacy and campaigning locally and trying to support regeneration projects on the ground in like a material way. And that kind of made me think, actually, it was a bit of a shock to the system, because I was like, some people do not think that the environmental or the tree planting feature of forest is really not important to them at all. And they don't see the point in it. So that was quite a profound moment, because I was like, I have this conception that, great, this is a way to environmental contribution. And then she was like, well, no, it's pointless. And I was like, oh, not really sure how to go about this, but I wouldn't have got that insight if I hadn't have insisted on interviewing.
That's so interesting, isn't it? Because I suppose a lot of people seeing this from the outside might assume that that is the primary motivation that people engage with the app for, but obviously in her case it wasn't. So for her, was it purely as like a sort of productivity app then that she used?
Yeah, it's productivity, and I guess that also leads into nicely leads into another part, which was the kind of community atmosphere. And I really had underestimated this being at all relevant to my dissertation. I think and this again alludes to what you said about navigating research. It's a very messy process, and you have this conception and an idea of, you have your research questions, you have what you want to get out of the project, you might have something that you're more interested in. So for me, it was the environmental side that I was most interested in. But actually, particularly when you're studying something new, which hasn't been studied, you're forced to engage with the fact that, hang on, people might actually not care about the environmental side, and they might use the app for completely different reasons. And the community building was really something that I didn't anticipate. And as I went about trying to find people to interview, I found these crazy like communities that were built around this app, people literally spending day in, day out communicating via Discord, like doing joint planting sessions, and it really was properly ingrained in the fabric of like their existence almost, because they were so passionate about it, and they'd met people. And I remember one particular person that I interviewed, she was a manager of like a Discord server. I'd never used Discord or anything, but she was a manager of a Discord server, or I don't know what the correct term is. And she like referred to the people that she does joint planting sessions with. Bear in mind, they'd never met in real life, they'd never met in person, they'd like vaguely spoken, but she like used the term "I love them," as in I love my community and I love the people that I spend the day to day, like every day, even digitally, I love them. And that use of the word love, I was like, I'm someone who values like in-person connections a lot, and I find it a little bit more difficult to establish those sorts of deep relationships online. But I was like, this is awesome. Like the fact that you've used this app, and I kind of just, yeah, I guess I stumbled upon this world of like people who literally live and breathe forests. And I was like, whoa, I have no idea. And they were also super helpful when it came to when I kind of had worked my way into that community. They were helpful with connecting me with other people that I could then interview, which was cool.
Yeah, that must have been so helpful for the sort of snowballing effect of
Yeah,
it, for sure.
yeah, definitely.
No, so that's super interesting because it was something almost so unexpected compared to what you
Mm,
thought of the app at the start. So really,
yeah.
really interesting.
And I think my
No, go on.
sorry to interrupt.
No,
My
no.
my supervisor constantly, because I ended up, for people who haven't read my dissertation, which is I assume the majority of the audience, I ended up kind of structuring my project in two ways. The first, and two research questions really. First research question was addressing this fact that forest was a completely unstudied digital technology from a geographical perspective. And then the second was the environmental side. And my supervisor continually had to remind me and pester me and say the first part of your dissertation is really important, and it's actually really interesting to read as well, because I was like, I wasn't so passionate about it, and talking about the kind of very much like digital geographies, like how is this app, how does it shape everyday spaces and relationships and individuals' experiences. I wasn't really too interested in that, but she constantly had to, my supervisor constantly said to me, like, this is important and it's interesting, so stick with it, because, and actually it was. And yeah, so that was just a little interference, but yeah, you never know kind of which bits of your dissertation end up being interesting. And yeah, so
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that is the whole part of the research, isn't it? You don't necessarily know what the outcome is going to be. And if you did, then
yeah,
is it really research, for sure?
well, that's a
Um,
good question.
Going back to that point about the community that you sort of discovered in Forest, I'm wondering how much the developers of the app are sort of aware of this, and whether it's all sort of like self-organized or whether they curate it in any way. How much do they sort of engage with the ways that people use the app, from your knowledge?
Yeah, so from my knowledge, which is not extensive, I think they initially hadn't built any kind of like joint planting functions. They hadn't really built the app around it being a particularly a remote productivity tool. I think in person, they probably always went with the assumption that people might use it in person and they might use it together. But then and I can't remember exactly at which point in the development of the product, or what year it was, that they built in this function, but they built in this joint planting function. I think they probably started to notice, actually this is getting a bit of traction in the remote product and like digital productivity space. So they built in this function where you can plant trees together. And there were, and part of this also means that if you and I, Jack, were to set a timer right now on Forest, we could do a joint planting session. If I pick up my phone, that ruins your session. So your session is then kaput and you can't get any points. So it adds in
Right.
this interesting dynamic, and quite a contentious one at that. A few of the people that I'd mentioned had talked about these kind of Discord servers, and people had been like forcibly removed and excluded from doing sessions because they consistently would ruin the session and like
Wow.
wouldn't allow people to get their green credit. So yeah, it turned into quite a battle between
That's
people.
really interesting, isn't it? That's like
Yeah,
this whole social behavior around accountability, and
yes, exactly.
but also being sort of remote, because it's not
Mm,
like, say, having a joint study session at a library necessarily, because
no.
and you can see what the other person is doing, but
Mm,
then yeah, suddenly you could realize, oh no, they picked up their phone.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And they've ruined
Wow.
the, yeah, so that was funny.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. And you said that the developers of the app, they you weren't sure if they actually really expected this at the start, and they sort of developed this more. I'm just wondering how much you sort of engaged with the company in general, and whether you managed to talk to anyone at Seeker Tech, I think is the developer, and
Yeah,
yeah, how
yes.
that relationship unfolded in your
Yeah,
research.
it was it was an interesting one. I think I did want to speak to Seeker Tech in some capacity or another because I just thought it would be cool to, and I thought just to add some another dimension to the product. Obviously, I'm going to talk to users, I'm learning it myself, but then also
Hmm.
it would be interesting to talk to the developers and see their side. Um, and my approach was a bit almost stalkery. It was kind of weird. I was like messaging them on LinkedIn, like messaging their Instagram profiles, so that they have like social media accounts and stuff. So I was trying to direct message them and say like, can I get an interview? Can I speak to you guys about this? And it was also difficult because it's an undergrad project which is not funded. And that kind of, not that that's an essential thing in saying to Seeker Tech, like if I said to Seeker Tech, cool, I'll pay you £50 for an interview, I don't think that would have been the difference.
Yeah.
I think it was more like a partly because it was a Taiwanese company, partly a language barrier and just a cultural barrier, I guess, and geographical. And they didn't really have too much interest in like this random geography student. They probably thought I was a scammer or something. This random
Yeah.
geography guy wants to talk to us about this project. But I did end up speaking to one employee at the company who worked more on the design and development side. So again, that was an example. I probably would have wanted to go in and speak a little bit about the, I guess, the kind of problematic tendencies and this whole idea of green neoliberalism and stuff like that, and kind of challenge them on that. Not so much challenge, but trying to interrogate that side of the technology. But then the person that I ended up speaking to was more on the design side, and
Mm.
I'd already done a couple of interviews at this point with some users and had started to build out this kind of first section of my dissertation just about how the app is designed and how those kind of the designs contribute to the persuasive kind of devices that are built into the app. Um, so yeah, I did speak to them, and it wasn't with the exact intention that I wanted to speak to them about, but yeah, it was. I still, nevertheless, interesting insights from it.
Yeah, brilliant. And I'm kind of interested as well from that company perspective, and this is probably the last I'll talk about them actually, because I don't want to focus too much. It's more about, the app itself and the experience of it. But a lot of people are sort of wary of tech companies now and sort of startups and these kinds of initiatives. And I guess I'm a little bit interested in the politics and the power around Seeker Tech and how the operations unfold. So I'm
Mhm.
wondering if you have any insights on that based on your research.
Yeah, so I think this particularly came to a head in this topic in the very final part of my dissertation. So
Mhm.
within the kind of critiquing the app from an environmental perspective, it kind of transpired that I ended up breaking that into a few different facets, which we can talk about in a bit more detail. But one of these facets was this idea of trying to calculate what the scale of contribution that they make to their philanthropic partner was relative to their overall kind of revenue and how they monetize the platform because they are a private company.
Yeah.
And again, like the transparency online and the amount of information that was available was very scarce. So it was quite like it was me kind of just trying to piece together what was going on, and then that also involved me, and I think this is what's kind of interesting in terms of the tech companies and what you mentioned about people being apprehensive about these companies, particularly from a data side. And because you have people who are investing a lot of time in this app, I think a few interviewees kind of noted their skepticism around how the data is used, and I went into the T's and C's and like all of the documents explaining that, which I never ever do for anything else. I'm not a massive tech skeptic, but I know like one of my very close friends and flatmates, he is pretty skeptical of these sorts of technologies and big data and this whole idea. And from that, from delving into whatever was published by Forest, I kind of pieced together that actually they are within this kind of nexus of tech companies. They still feed into it, and yeah, so they're kind of, they do sit in and they do play the game a little bit with the kind of data selling, etc., tailored advertising and things like that. So they do sit within this kind of, I don't know how you describe it. A nexus is the best way I can think right now. But yeah, so that was another bit about kind of just the transparency of these technologies that came to a head when I was trying to find ways to piece together what they do with the data, how they monetize the platform, etc. Like selling user data, for example, to big companies. Won't name them individually, but yeah.
Yeah. And it's interesting the kind of stuff you're saying there as well, because Forest, so I knew a bit about it before I read your dissertation, and I never used it myself, but I was aware of sort of what the platform did. And it reminded me a lot of other similar services, but maybe not quite the same thing. So things like Ecosia, who plant trees based on web browser searches and stuff like that. And yeah, I guess I'm interested in how you see Forest sitting in that wider ecosystem of platforms that engage with the environment in that kind of way.
Yeah, it's a weird thing, and again, particularly from an academic perspective, I think, well, you'll know more than me about this, but it's an incredibly nascent field. You have like these technologies like spiraling out of control, just coming out of nowhere. Everyone's trying to find ways to connect individuals to these environmental platforms, and they're doing it in kind of often quite tenuous ways. And that's where the critical side of things come in, is this whole like taking advantage of the green like trend as things are, and trying to monetize them and trying to extract value from people's appetites to do something green. And yeah, Forest sits within that kind of this group of digital technologies which are trying to do similar things, as you said, like Ecosia, among other platforms. And in terms of whether I think the idea of whether they have a genuinely beneficial impact on the environment is an interesting one. And is one that I have no idea what the answer is to this question, because on the one hand, you like to think idealistically that you are making a material contribution, and you are doing something positive for the planet, but it's kind of at what cost. It's like, cool, if you're giving this platform loads of money and they are making a very minor contribution to an environmental charity, and kind of leveraging that as a point of marketing and things like that for their platform, is that problematic? The answer is yes, it is. But then you also have like the dimension which isn't so easily quantifiable, which is how does using an app like Forest, or how does using a platform like this also affect like people's general perception of green issues? Does it make them more passionate about these issues? And I think what Forest does is it creates like quite an effective emotional relationship almost. And I think in the same way, it's kind of in this entanglement of it being a platform that people and users are quite connected to on an emotional way. They build communities through it. I think within that, I would hope at least that the kind of environmental agenda and this idea of we want to work with and for the planet and heal the planet is kind of built into those communities a little bit, and built into people's radars, even if they might not consider it. And then you obviously have the problematic side, which is, well, cool, if Lucas here uses it, he thinks, cool, Lucas is doing his bit by planting one tree, which is really has a negligible environmental impact, which there have been plenty of studies to prove that fact. So yeah, it's a weird one. I would like to think that they do have an important impact, but yeah, I'm constantly trying to think about where exactly the levers of change are for these sorts of issues, like the levers of real systemic change. And yeah, that's again why I wanted to investigate the private sector and dig into that. Like, what is the private sector doing specifically? Here's an example. I want to take that, I want to study it and interrogate it a little bit. But yeah, I guess you can frame it in whichever way you want to. But ultimately, I came to the conclusion that I think Seeker Tech are trying to do something good, and they don't. This is a key thing as well. In comparison to other platforms, they really don't use their tree planting functionality as a marketing tool. And this is where I came to the conclusion that actually, like, we're very quick to criticize within academia. I think extremely quick to, and very skeptical about things, which is cool. It's also part of being critical, and it's important. But also there's this kind of inertia, and I framed it in terms of an inertia. It's like they're trying to do something good, but they might not be aware of how they are necessarily excluding people or not delivering a real and substantive impact. But because they didn't really use the environmental side as a marketing tool, I kind of deemed it personally like they're not trying to exploit the green agenda necessarily. I mean, if they were to do it, it would be a very understated way. But I like to, again, this might be just over optimistic and idealistic, but yeah, I think they do. These sorts of technologies have a role to play.
Yeah. I think there's part of what makes it like a really interesting topic to study, actually, is that it kind of drives right at the heart of so much of what we in geography especially think about when we think about digital technology, in the sense of that, like, there might be a perceived disconnection between stuff in one place and stuff that's online, and stuff that's around you. So there's that sort of sense of alienation, but at the same time there's the sense of connection with other people as well that it provides that just wouldn't have been possible without a lot of these technologies. And it kind of your example of Forest kind of proves both of these points, doesn't it? Because there's the whole community side of things, and the fact that it's getting people to engage with each other and in that way, but at the same time it's the relationship with the environment might be more ambivalent, but that's up for debate. So
it's an interesting one. It's a constant existential question that I ask myself, is whether these technologies are good, what side of the fence I should fall on. But like a geographer, I like to be as diplomatic as possible. Not take too many sides. But
I think that's probably a good place to be in as an academic, for sure.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in thinking about existing research that you might have encountered in this area as well, because obviously we've talked about how, Forest, there didn't seem to be much research about it before your dissertation. But was there any kind of existing research that influenced your own study or your own kind of research ideas?
I think so, definitely. I think one body of scholarship that I tried to kind of time my research into and build upon was Smart Forest, just as a subset of digital ecologies, which is this kind of broader group, which I'm sure you're aware of, who study similar things to what I study. But one in particular was Smart Forest, which kind of is just very, very broad ranging. It sounds super niche, but again, like the content of research, super broad ranging, from like random things. And one of those was similar platforms to Forest, like Ecosia, that are trying to like enhance civic participation. And I think in terms of increasing participation and trying to connect individuals to environmental activities, a lot of them were focused on this idea of citizen science and lay. And then there's this whole body of scholarship within geography just about like the integration of lay or kind of more less like scientific and institutionalized forms of knowledge. How are we going to integrate them to solve these sorts of challenges? Anyway, so Smart Forest, super broad ranging research focus. And within that, though, and again, I think it's more of a product because it's such a nascent body of scholarship, and so recent developments. A lot of the articles seem to cover lots of different things. So it would be like a content analysis of 50 different platforms, all trying to do a somewhat similar thing and trying to find synergies between them and common themes throughout them. Whereas obviously within a dissertation as well, you need to be super focused. And I was like, I looked at this body of scholarship, and again, super broad ranging, but I was like, no one's really dedicated 12,000 words of a dissertation. No one's really bothered to go into that much detail about one specific technology. And yeah, so that's kind of where I thought I could contribute, is like a really focused, really in-depth, just look at one technology. There were a couple of studies that had been done on ant forests as well. So the previous idea, which I thankfully all of that work wasn't just put to waste, because I could still kind of, similar platform, I could still embed some of my ideas in the literature from that technology. But they were typically more done from a psychological perspective or a commercial perspective.
Right.
But that was also in part what inspired or kind of prompted me to use this idea of motivation theory, which I imagine you were going to ask about. So I'll
Yeah, I'd
comment
love
on
to hear more about that, because that was
that.
that was a key aspect of your research. So yeah, let's talk about motivation theory.
Yeah, so I guess for me, I'm someone who quite likes having structure. Naturally, like I think all of my essay writing was all trying to be very structured, and obviously you need to appreciate the complexity and how entangled things are in geography, but also I like having structure. So motivation theory was something that was employed more in the psychological and commercial studies that I mentioned with ant forest. And it was quite a good way to approach the project structurally. And it provided me with that idea, okay, cool, I can break this down into a couple of different problems and then interrogate them individually. Also, again, I'm not trying to overlook the complexities and the nuances and interconnectivities between them, but yeah, it's kind of this approach to research. And as I said, from a psychological perspective, and Forrest was interrogated in terms of why are people actually using this app, like what is appealing about this app. And motivation theory, it does what it says in the tin. It breaks down why do people use this app, why are they engaged with it. And I suppose, like the structure of my dissertation, which was on the one hand looking at why do people use it, not from an environmental perspective, how do people interact with it on a daily basis, that was kind of the intrinsic, for me, idea. So motivation theory, you have intrinsic motivation, extrinsic motivation. Everyone will kind of understand that distinction. And my dissertation and my research questions were kind of, what will the intrinsic dimensions of the technology, how do they manifest and materialize? So that is things like, how does the design influence people's interactions with it? And then the extrinsic, which was predominantly the environmental regeneration, this idea that I'm having some greater impact than myself. It's not just me using this, I'm having like a cascading impact on an environmental issue. So it kind of provided me with quite a good approach. That dichotomy, so to speak, was kind of deconstructed, because I was then trying to sort of position certain dimensions of the project. So when I looked at like community, for example, that theme, I was struggling to see, okay, where exactly does that fit into my intrinsic versus extrinsic kind of binary? Because at the same time as it's your ability to help one another is fundamentally an extrinsic thing. It's kind of like you're bringing value to other people and you're working together and you're doing it and you're getting a kick out of helping your friend who's also being productive 5,000 miles away. But at the same time, it's kind of an intrinsic thing because it's a function that's built into the app. So that kind of became a little bit blurred, but I suppose it was just a good way for me to structure my approach and, I guess distinguish between what I perceived as more things that were built into the app. How were these persuasive devices made? Like, particularly on the design side, I think it was useful. And then the extrinsic stuff, which is talking to people and say, do you think your tree planting has a genuine impact? To which there were obviously varying answers, as I touched on earlier. But yeah, it was an interesting one, and I thought it was a useful thing for studying these sorts of technologies.
Yeah, definitely. It really sounds like it was a useful way for delving into that topic. And we've already talked a bit about, as you just alluded, to some of the things that you found through your research and some of the interesting anecdotes that you got from talking to people. But when you look back on your research findings now, are there any that sort of stand out as being, the most interesting to you, or the most potentially impactful or surprising?
Yeah, I think overall, and this is actually something revisiting the project now, the value of having a diverse base of interviewees was really important. And I think that within itself was probably, looking back and reflecting now, like I haven't looked at it for 6 months, my dissertation, like hardly at all. And I think now, looking back at it, that was probably the most important part of my dissertation and the biggest personal learning. I think from an academic perspective, what were interesting findings, I would say there was this point that I had, and again, this came from the diversity. I spoke to someone in Tunisia, right? And I was talking about the app. She was someone who was very, very active on all of these kind of communities, and Facebook groups were the main kind of way that I found my way into them. She was super active on them. And then I was talking a little bit about the app, and I had approached the interviews with kind of this idea of semi-structured interviews. Like, I have broad topics that I want to touch on, but I don't want to steer it too much. I want to just give them a platform. And when we were talking about this, I then asked her, basically the app has like this premium subscription. There's like many apps, there's a basic version and a premium version. And we were talking about that. And then she had basically mentioned that she used the app for like 3 years without having the premium version. And the basic version is, as it says on the tin, it's very basic. Not many functionalities, not particularly exciting app to use. And I was like, I have no idea why you did that. And she said, well, yeah, the only way I could actually get access to the app was by installing a VPN, which could then connect me to a London-based or a UK-based, I don't know, server. And then she could actually pay for the app. And then I stumbled across this idea that I guess these technologies are fundamentally built to democratize and trying to spread participation, that enable people from all over the planet. It's trying to enable them to connect to these issues and kind of be unified in supporting one particular project that's going on, for example, in Africa. It's trying to connect all these people, but actually at the same time, it serves to exclude certain people because non-conformity to Western financial and technological infrastructures that serves, so it kind of includes people, but at the same time it excludes people. So I had this idea, or I kind of intertwined this within an idea of technologies as like simultaneously like enabling these sorts of connections and digital relationships, but also disabling them and excluding people. So I think that was something that I hadn't really thought of. I think there was another part which was this what I termed this illusion of expenditure, purely for lack of an ability to think of a better name for it. But as I mentioned, the app has a premium subscription. And when I spoke to some people about when they actually finally planted a tree, because it takes quite a long time to plant a tree to accumulate enough credit to actually do it. When I spoke to them, they basically were kind of like talking about it and were like, oh, it's great. Like, Secatech and Forest, they do it for free. And I was like, hold on a minute, they do it for free, but you've paid for this app. So I then stumbled across this thing where I was like, this is really, well, in some ways problematic, because you are obviously contributing financially and you paid for it. So you're still paying for the tree to be planted ultimately. But because of the time lag between actually buying the app and buying the subscription and actually being able to donate a tree, that kind of payment that you made becomes like you kind of forget that it ever happened, and you think that Secatech or Forest is this altruistic kind of, it does it for free. And this wasn't just like one interview. It's very easy, I think, when you're doing research, to take one specific example and overdo it and write a whole section about it. But this was like a consistent theme throughout. And then I kind of embedded that in this body of scholarship, which is kind of thinks about and interrogates this idea that neoliberalization as a process and the commodification of nature is becoming increasingly illegible, because these technologies work in clever ways to kind of make you think that, it's almost making you think that they're doing something good, but you're actually paying ultimately. And they're kind of exploiting, again, this kind of the green fad at the moment. Well, hopefully not a fad, but exploiting this market opportunity. So yeah, I guess that those were two that were quite interesting.
Wow, yeah, that's super interesting, especially that last example. It's reminded me actually of some research. So my research is on games and people that have looked at the ways that games sort of structure experiences. So people like James Ash, and a lot of that research looks into the ways that sort of the flow of the experience through the game or the app or whatever it is sort of broken down into like different kinds of like flow and different kinds of like points where you're inhibited in your movement or not. And then and all of that is just a tactic to potentially get you to kind of spend more money without necessarily realizing it. And yeah, it's just interesting the parallels between different types of digital software and the experiences of it and what ultimately happens, you know, money wise or on the ground or super interesting.
They're built, these systems are built in clever ways. You wouldn't think about it, but they really are clever in that sense. But again, I don't want to portray that I think that Seeker Tech are trying to exploit people, but they are built in fundamentally clever ways. And
and I guess that shows the value of doing this kind of research for sure. So I only have a couple more things to ask you really, but I think one of the interesting questions that is always good to ask, and I suppose it kind of goes back to that whole researcher journey thing, is the biggest challenges that you face during your research, because all research is obviously fraught with challenges and unexpected things that come up. So yeah, I'd just love to hear about what you faced during research.
So I think that for me, aside from finding my actual topic and honing down, which was a challenge and a half, it was just, again, funny this, it was a similar when as I mentioned at the start of the interview, when all of my peers who were also starting the journey of their dissertation, they said, how are you going to get people to interview for this? It was, my biggest challenge was finding people to interview, again, because I was pretty insistent and stubborn on the fact that I didn't just want to interview friends of friends who would kind of all have a similar experience, similar perspective. I wanted a very much like a global and diverse user base, and that caused a lot of sleepless nights and was extremely difficult to do, obviously. But things like the communities, I never would have found the community building dimension of it if I hadn't properly committed. And at times I was like, oh my goodness, I really cannot. I cannot fathom doing this. So my approach was to join like these Facebook groups, these Facebook online communities, which all had, well, there are a couple of big ones that had 8,000 to 15,000 members, maybe. So I was like, easy, no problemo. I will find participants who want to do it straight away. First of all, a lot of them were fairly inactive, which was something that I hadn't really anticipated. And so people obviously do posts on Facebook, so I was kind of like assuming, okay, I'll start with those sorts of people and I'm going to send them a message, people who have been recently active. But when your most recent post is from like 6 months ago, it's pretty difficult, because I think the trajectory that these communities followed in terms of community building was probably early on they were collated on Facebook and then they moved to Discord. And I had no means of connecting into Discord immediately. And again, some of these networks were built on trust. And as we commented earlier, it's very much like relationships. It's not just like it's a random person. Like these are friends and loved ones in one of the interviewees' terms. Anyway, so I was like cold messaging people, basically. I felt like a salesperson. I was like, I'm doing this research. I had people, I had responses ranging from, I'll tell you that in a second. I had responses ranging from like, I think you're a scam, like, and then I had one lady who came back to me and was like, I've done, like, who are you? Why are you messaging me? Like, I don't want you to message me. Why have you found my profile on Facebook? Like, I've done lots of research. I got a PhD. Like, no research would ever be unfunded. Like, how dare you message me? And I was like, hold on, I'm doing an undergrad dissertation. That's why I have no money. And like, this is such a aggressive response, completely unnecessary. And she started using bad language, and I was like, this is completely unnecessary. But anyway, on top of that, I also, because I obviously wasn't typing unique messages to 50 different people, so I was just sending like the same copy and paste message, like, hi, excuse the unsolicited, like random message, like, I'm doing this research, I'd love to talk to you, or at least have an initial conversation about you participating and sharing your insights about Forest. And it actually got so bad that because I was using Facebook, I was messaging loads of different people. My ability to message people on my Facebook account got blocked for like 3 days. They thought I was like a spammer. They thought I was like
Wow.
a scam artist. So I got blocked from using Facebook for a few days. And that's when I took to Instagram and was like, okay, I'm just going to message the forest Instagram and try and find users through that. But it was such a convoluted way of finding people. But yeah, I guess persistence, I stuck with it and I managed to get a very good and diverse sample size. I had people from basically every continent who I spoke to,
Mm.
which was really good and interesting and provided more kind of unique insights than I could have ever hoped for, I guess. I
Yeah.
can't, right now, looking back on it, I cannot think about how I would even write 12,000 words if I'd have just interviewed people from like similar universities, similar backgrounds. Like,
Yeah.
in the grand scheme, obviously there's diversity within that, but like the geographical diversity and having a true global sample is completely different, like different ballparks,
Yeah.
diversity of thought, and yeah, so that was a very valuable thing, but hard to get and took persistence, I have to say.
Yeah. Yeah, it really shows the importance of like finding those sort of gatekeepers into the communities that like when you finally found your way into that Discord and then
Yeah,
suddenly you had this world of active users and
yeah,
obviously it sort of snowballed from there. But
yeah,
it's
exactly.
interesting. It just reminded me of something I thought about earlier when you mentioned how your research started shortly after COVID. And I'm wondering whether the fact that everyone in COVID's sort of I say everyone, but most people got used to using Zoom and
Mm,
doing things remotely. And obviously, you wanted a diverse participant base for your
yeah.
research. So, do you think that probably helped in terms of reaching out and being able to speak to all these different people?
Yeah, I think so. And actually, that reminds me, I don't think I ever actually wrote about this or wrote up this specific part for my final dissertation, but one of the people that I spoke to who was kind of the same one that referred to the other people within her community as loving them. She was this kind of Discord moderator. That's the correct term.
Hmm.
That's come back to me now. Um, she was the moderator, and she had said like this community has transformed through COVID because we are. She actually interestingly she said they did use some kind of like calling platforms and they kind of called each other over phone calls, but it's not in the same way. And COVID, when everyone became more accustomed to being on a Zoom call and sitting face to face with strangers and doing calls like this, meeting someone completely random. And I think that really deepened like the relationships that were embedded within this community. And she mentioned that as well.
Wow.
Um, and I think she actually said that there was like a New York meetup. She was from New York,
Mm.
very nice lady, but they did like a New York study group meetup, where I think a couple of people had flown over from around the world, not specifically to meet these people, but were just there for work or whatever. But
Mm.
these communities were formed of like all different ages and yeah, a very eclectic mix of people, I'd say. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Like these technologies have facilitated the community building to like an extra gear, I suppose, because before it was kind of it's still interact, but yeah, so it's been quite transformative for those communities, I think, which is
Yeah.
again cool.
Yeah, no, and I guess it made your use of those methods for talking to them like more appropriate as well, in that you were using potentially the platforms that they
Oh
were already
yeah,
using to talk to each
yeah,
other. So
that was another thing where people
yeah.
were another challenge was the reluctance to actually do an interview. Some people asked for a form. I think I did end up. I can't even remember if I wrote this into my dissertation, but I did end up creating a form for people to fill out as well because I noticed early on that a couple of people were quite reluctant to do a call. Some people, like, fair enough, didn't want their camera on. Some people didn't feel that they spoke proficient enough English to be able to do the interview. So they wanted to do a form. So I think I designed a form. I'm not sure if I mentioned it in my final one, but I wrote a form together based on my first few interviews. I kind of was like, okay, these have been interesting points. So I'll pop them into a form and let people respond through that. But yeah, all sorts of challenges. But yeah, definitely
Yeah.
useful.
Super interesting and thinking about the opportunities and challenges of like digital methods, I guess. And you
Yeah,
could almost write like a paper based just on this bit of
well, you
research on all
could.
the
I'm
different
sure
types
you
of
could.
digital methods you could use. So
Yeah,
yeah, that's really interesting
hardly scratch the surface as well.
for
It's
sure.
lots of things.
So I
Mm,
want to touch now just on something that I could tell was quite important to you from reading your dissertation, which was the recommendations that you made at the end, and I could tell that that was a really important thing that you wanted to put out there as a sort of impact of your research. So yeah, tell me more about those and the sort of reason why you were so attached to the idea and ultimately what you found.
Yeah, so I guess the recommendations dimension for context, I kind of, for those who haven't read the dissertation, I obviously approached, as I described at the start, I approached this dissertation with the idea that like I'm a pragmatist, I want to explore these sorts of private initiatives, private sector initiatives, whether they have a genuine impact, because I'd like to think that they do and they contribute in a meaningful way. And that kind of came full circle at the end, where I'd obviously written this fairly critical paper, as you know, interrogating all different parts of it. But then I did have this realization and thought to myself, actually, they don't really use the environmental side as a marketing tool, in my opinion. This might be controversial, but I don't think they really leverage it to the extent where you could criticize them and say they're exploiting, necessarily exploiting that kind of green appetite that people have. So yeah, I came to this conclusion that actually there's more of an inertia around it. And I think the same can be, I can't think of any right now, but I'm sure the same is applicable for other corporations who are trying to do good, so to speak, but don't really understand the complexity of some of the issues, and certain critiques they might not even be aware of them. So one of them, so I wanted to finish the research with just some ideas that people can consider to start to undo some of the potentially problematic tendencies that the technologies have. So examples of this, I think the payment infrastructure one was a very interesting one. So I'd done a couple of modules at university on like the geographies of finance, and kind of like financial networks and infrastructures. And a big theme within that is kind of peer-to-peer payment systems, which are a big thing in the developing world. Like we obviously are, in the UK in particular, we have these massive conglomerate retail banks who everyone basically uses, but actually in the developing world, the financial infrastructure looks very, very different. And it's quite common, or it was common. And what I realized from speaking to the person from Tunisia was actually that these peer-to-peer payment systems were a potential solution that they could explore, because obviously traditional payment infrastructure was kind of excluding people from participating, but actually these offered a kind of different lens. So I thought that was one for the kind of democratizing participation side that Seekatech could focus on. Another one was kind of using Forest app as more of an educational platform. Obviously, you don't want to, and I appreciate with an app, like you don't want to do too much to overcomplicate what's going on. But I think some users also shared this, that they felt that Forest, the app, could do a little bit more to educate people. And I can't remember exactly what this new, but there was Seekatech have since released a new app or a new platform, which has a similar kind of impetus that it wants to do good. And it has more of an educational angle. I can't remember the exact name. I should probably look into it. Could write another paper on it. No, I'm joking. I'm joking. But yeah, so I think there were some people that felt that there could be, more of an emphasis on the education side of thing. And I think equally that's a critique of Trees for the Future, who are this company, the philanthropic partner, which was a whole separate part of my dissertation, where I kind of interrogated that a little bit. I didn't want to get too off topic because fundamentally I was focused on forest, but I also wanted to look at that. And Trees for the Future, they're this company that, well, not a company, an NGO, that are quite savvy with their corporate partnerships and offering these sorts of I don't know how their model is structured, but they're good at connecting with big companies and small companies. Well, Seekatech's not a massive company, but it led into that and looking a little bit about how, Trees for the Future, for example, their key metric that they like to communicate is the number of trees planted, in the same way that forests tell you, oh, we've planted 2.1 million trees throughout our entire life. But actually, when you're on the ground and looking at conservation, the sheer number of trees that have been planted does not equal the number of trees which have successfully grown. And you don't really know how much carbon they've removed from the atmosphere. You don't know in 10 years, will the trees still be there, or will whatever the planting sites, will they have been completely demolished by some invasive species? Like, you don't really know these KPIs and you don't understand the complexities. And obviously at the same time, you want to keep things simple, but you also want to provide a platform to educate. So I think that was another thing. And then I think finally, just in the interest of not waffling on too much about the recommendation side of things, but there was also this idea that, and to also simultaneously hit this education point, which is choosing projects and choosing philanthropic partners that were potentially more local. And obviously part of the beauty of forest is that you can contribute to something very far afield, but equally I was kind of sat there thinking, how cool would it be if my contribution could be for rewilding projects in the UK, which are really important from an environmental regeneration perspective, maybe not as sexy as like tree planting in sub-Saharan Africa or something like that, but actually it's a very important thing. And in terms of building more of a tangible relationship between people and environmental issues, I think that would be a great way to do it. Like, look at local charities and, okay, cool, we've got these users, these are some really cool projects that are going on in the local area. But again, those were just recommendations, and it was just, yeah, I suppose I wanted to end the dissertation on a positive note, which was like, it's not just this terrible app who are exploiting people, but like there are ways that we can work to undo some problematic tendencies or potentially negative parts of the technology and try and rework in a collaborative way, rework some of those issues.
Yeah, no, those are all like super interesting findings and ultimately further steps forward that could be taken. And yeah, I think that point about local initiatives is a really interesting one, especially when considering that sort of potential alienation that digital technology brings with us. It's like, could we use that digital infrastructure to actually then influence where we are physically as well? So
it's like
really
going up to come back down, like realize what's going on around you almost.
Yeah, for sure. No, exactly. We've covered a lot, so like thank you so much for your time. I guess I just want to end by asking like what you're doing now and where your research has taken you and like what your plans are for the future.
Sure. So right now I've deviated quite far from the research world. So I, again, perhaps this was me being idealistic, but I was kind of I wanted to work in and experience the private sector and kind of understand from that side of things how these sorts of problems are being addressed. And I'm on a grad scheme in a company called London Stock Exchange, who are the kind of this financial infrastructure company. And what initially actually appealed to me about the company was they're doing a lot of stuff within, because they sit at the center of financial markets. They are doing quite a lot of stuff to kind of, and ranging from advocacy to actual products. They're doing quite a lot of like green finance initiatives. So I wanted to work in the private sector and explore these issues from that angle. At the moment, I'm working in a very niche risk management team that is quite far from sustainable finance, but I'm trying to work my way into that world to experience that. But I guess the dissertation was a good way for me to, develop my writing skills, develop my networking skills, even develop my how I articulate ideas and stuff. So I think it really equips you with a good skill set moving forward. And I hold true that I would love to revisit academia and do some more research at some point, well, particularly with a research focus. So I was going to go to the US to do a master's, but then it transpired that I didn't. I thought I'd take a job first and then maybe go and do a master's in a few years. But yeah, I think hopefully if you're an inquisitive person, or at least I'd hope that there's always a door open in academia to explore more topics. So yeah.
Yeah, I think certainly, and given like the interesting research that you've done, and you've clearly got curiosity to kind of learn more and to delve into these topics. So I think that stands you in really good stead. So
yeah, I'd hope so.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your experiences and ideas. Just a really interesting conversation just about doing research and the trials and tribulations of that, but also the really interesting and rich detail and learning that you get from that, which is kind of unique and one of the excellent things about dissertations and in geography programs. So
Yeah.
really
Yeah,
great.
well,
And
thank
thank
you.
you.
Thank you very much for having me. And congratulations to any viewers if you're still watching by now or listening by now. Congrats. You made it at the end. But yeah, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity and good luck for everything in future.
Brilliant, thank you. And just to end, I should probably make a plug as the prize coordinator of the DGRG that we run our undergraduate dissertation prize every year. So this year, I think the deadline is the 12th of July. And if it's not that precise date, it'll be around that time. So we accept submissions of dissertations on any topics that are related to geographies through the digital, produced by the digital or of the digital, any of those sort of broad connections between geographies and digital technology. Usually they're of first class standard, but if you need any more information, then just go on the RGS website and look for the Research Group Dissertation Prizes page. If you just search for it online, you should be able to find it pretty easily. And all the further information you'll need is on there. If you want to know more about the Digital Geographies Research Group, you can go to our website, which is digitalgeographiesrg.org, and you can learn more about us there. But otherwise, that just leaves me to say thank you again to Lucas and congratulations on winning our 2023 dissertation prize.
Thank you very much, Jack. All right, and good luck to next year's winners and everyone doing their dissertation.
Brilliant. Thank you.
All right, thank you.